this in three parts. First of all, just look at digital disruption itself. What is it? What are some examples of it? Secondly, look at specific hardware, look at hardware and software technologies and how they're becoming all pervasive. Then secondly, we'll look at the ramifications for this in the supply chain, how logistics and supply chain activities are being impacted by digital technologies in a way that is going to dramatically change the future of supply chain management. And then thirdly, to close with some reflections and takeaways, and also identify some of the pitfalls, three specific recent examples, very recent examples, of some of the pitfalls of digital technology. Okay, so digital disruption, what is it? And what are these hardware and software technologies that are becoming all pervasive in our daily lives? Digital disruption it's the change that occurs when new digital technologies and business models affect and impact the value proposition of existing goods and services business models. It does not generally come from within. It's not the incumbents that cause digital disruption. Generally speaking, digital disruption comes from the outside or underneath. What does that mean? Well, let me give you some examples. Here are some household brand names where digital disruption was empowered by these brands. They were not incumbents in their sector, but they've dramatically changed the business model within their sector through leveraging digital technology. And many established companies that were in these sectors either are no more or are really struggling to recover and catch up to what has come from outside and underneath. So this is revolutionary impact on certain sectors through the leveraging of digital technology. Not to be underestimated. So I bracket into four areas, digital technology groups that are really gaining momentum now. Number one is artificial intelligence. This has become so scary that we had to come up with a new name for it because the concept of artificial intelligence made us a little bit wary about the future, about how the robots might take over the world and our lives. So now we call it machine learning, is the new word for artificial intelligence. Not quite so scary. Secondly, we have virtual reality, where through digital technology, we can transpose ourselves to be in another place ensconced with a headset. At Christmas, I was on vacation in Sydney, Australia, and there's a Titanic museum exhibition there. And with a virtual reality headset on, my wife and I were actually in the wreck of the Titanic, going around inside, seeing the inside of the Titanic, all the rusty poles, the demolished ballroom staircase through virtual reality. Phenomenal experience. Number three, we have augmented reality. This is where we supplement something that already exists in the real world and we augment it with additional digital technology. As you can see from the number three picture, this has serious applications in terms of distribution centers. And then fourthly, we have this blockchain. Now, for me, blockchain is halfway up the pinnacle of the hype cycle. And I think in the next 12 months, we'll probably reach that peak of hype. In reality, my view is that blockchain, in terms of mainstream, large-scale, public deployment across business entities, is at least 5, if not 10 years away from mainstream deployment. The technology is there, undoubtedly, and it has certain high-profile pilot applications, but they're all on a private blockchain basis in terms of the supply chain trials with IBM, Kuehne+Nagel, Maersk, and other parties. But it's there and it will be coming. But it's like, when will it come? And I think there are other technologies that are going to impact our supply chains before blockchain really takes off on a scale basis. So if we think about the software side of it, the bits and the bytes, what is all coming together in these disruptive digital platforms? First of all, we've got the cloud. That's well established that everything is up in the cloud. Secondly, we've got the Internet of Things, whereby every device is connected or becoming connected somehow to the internet and therefore through the cloud. This generates enormous amounts of data, with all these devices being connected to the internet, transmitting data. We're overwhelmed with massive volumes of big data. If we know what to do with that data, which is a big if we know what to do with it, then we can get some real mining into the data and produce what we call predictive analytics. This is where we can analyze the data and predict what is going to happen. And in some cases, in our personal lives, or in my case, my niece and my nephew's personal lives, the big data monsters in the cloud, they know more about my niece's life than I do, and more importantly, than her mother does. And they know what she is going to do next before she knows what she's going to do next. So we put the cloud together with the Internet of Things, masses of data, and we're able to get predictive analytics. If we apply this to a business scenario, it becomes extremely useful, particularly in terms of inventory management and forecasting. So there was a survey just done this year, so it's less than 3 months old, by DHL, called Supply Chain Digitalization. And they asked their respondents, of these software technologies, what is the most important to your supply chain within the next 3 years? And these are the top 5 that came out in terms of being very important or extremely important. And we can see, I mentioned all these things already in the opening section. These are the things that are very or extremely important in the supply chain over the next 3 years. That's through to year 2021. And you can see how big data analytics and cloud-based applications and internet things all come together as the top 3 to enable this predictive modeling, the forecasting, better help the inventory management, better help the stock write-offs, and better help the transportation flows. So that's the software technologies. If we think more about the nuts and bolts rather than the bits and bytes, the nuts and bolts are the physical hardware technologies. There are also 4 key areas that are developing here that are enabling this digital world in the business applications that is going to have disruption impact on the supply chain. So first, and pretty widespread already, is robotics and automation. And we're seeing now the adoption of automation in Asia manufacturing environments that hitherto were based on large-scale, labor-intensive production. We're seeing the adoption of robotics and automation in factories in China, which used to be labor-dependent and now are adopting robotics and automation technology. Secondly, we're seeing sensors and automatic identification on just about everything and anything, from the fridge at home to the wheels on the truck to the boxes and packages themselves. Everything is going to have a sensor. It's going to be able to identify itself and connect to the internet and transmit information about what it is, where it's doing, what its temperature is, maybe what the humidity is, maybe how long it's been running. And again, this assembles the huge volumes of data. And then thirdly, on the hardware front, we see these things that we put on our bodies. And we're probably only a decade away where we might put them inside our bodies. There are already pilot programs going on where people have microchips inserted into either their finger or their thumb or their palm that can help with whatever it is. Access control is a key one. So wearables, we think about the eyeglass, we think about the finger scanner, we think about voice technologies. All these are becoming deployable on an economically viable business model in the supply chain. And then fourthly, we have autonomous vehicles. These are vehicles that effectively drive themselves. Perhaps the most dramatic examples that we see are the drones. And drones are really taking off in many areas from a consumer perspective, but also on a business perspective. But there are other types of autonomous vehicles, and I'll give you some examples of those later on. The challenge with the autonomous vehicle model is that the vehicle operates in an open environment, which is subject to other people and other vehicles that are not necessarily controlled by the autonomous system. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I give you the examples. So these are the four hardware technologies I see as permeating into the supply chain agenda. And that same study from DHL conducted just 2 months ago, the Digitalization Supply Chain Study, asked their respondents from the hardware technology perspective, what are the most important for your supply chain over the next 3 years? So same as the other question, which was software technology, same question, hardware technology. It's the deployment of autonomous vehicles. There are other users. And that's why autonomous vehicle deployment is going to take longer than these other technologies. Because we have to have the regulatory frameworks. We have to have the safety provisions. We have to understand when something goes wrong, who's going to be responsible. And our laws and our airspace and our roads and our insurance policies are not yet geared up for an autonomous vehicle environment. Nevertheless, the technology is there. This can be done. It can be deployed. So it's a case of the regulatory framework catching up, and then we will see large-scale adoption, probably 5 to 10 years from now. But trials are already underway. Number one here is Einride. This is in Sweden. Most of the autonomous trucks you see a video of a traditional truck with a driver in the truck who's sitting there not touching the steering wheel or the pedals. That's most of the videos we see about autonomous trucks, right? Okay, this truck has no cab. There is no cab on the Einride. So there is no place for a driver to sit there doing nothing, watching the steering wheel do itself. So this is really going to be autonomous vehicles. The second one is the deployment of technology in what is called platooning. Platooning is where 3 or more trucks travel effectively as one. They're not physically connected, like an Australian road train. They are digitally connected. And the technology is making truck 2 and 3 and 4 follow what truck number 1 is doing. Truck number 1 may have a driver. In theory, it could be running autonomously. Truck number 2, 3, and 4 don't need a physical human because they're digitally following what's happening. And there are trials, if we think of long-distance, highway-type environments, there are trials happening already for this technology to be deployed. And this helps efficiency, it reduces fuel consumption, it can reduce labor cost, less fuel is less emissions, more stability in the journey is less wear and tear on the road. There are lots and lots of good reasons why this technology makes sense. Not least of which is that in most developed markets, there is a drastic shortage of truck drivers. The average age of a truck driver in the UK is 57 years old. In the United States, it's about the same. In Hong Kong, it's 59 years old. So there's a shortage of truck drivers. So this can help address part of that labor shortage. But, again, it's in a public space environment. It's on a highway. There are other vehicles and other people in that same environment. Number 3 is autonomous container ships. This is a trial happening in the coastal waters of Norway. It is in operation this year, and they plan to deploy it commercially, subject to successful trials, in 2019. This is a container ship that is effectively unmanned. It is controlled from the central center. And this, in fact, can be platooned. So you could have a flotilla of container ships traveling together. It's being conducted on Norwegian coastal waters because that is in the jurisdiction of Norwegian maritime law. The IMO, the International Maritime Organization, does not have a regulatory framework in place yet to be able to deal with this. So that's why it's purely on coastal waters at the moment. But if we think about the primary costs of operating a container vessel, your primary operational cost is obviously your fuel, your depreciation, and your labor cost. So if container vessels can be deployed on an autonomous system, again, we could have large-scale disruption of the container shipping sector. And then finally, number 4, the drones. I used to be skeptical about drones in terms of the last-mile delivery of e-commerce packages because I couldn't see how it was going to be economically viable for a drone to pick up one package, take it 40 kilometers, and drop it down when generally it's free delivery for online shopping. So I didn't really see how that could make commercial business sense, apart from the marketing gravitas that it generates through quite sexy video shows. But now when we see this company, Chinese company JD.com, it's a very, very large-scale e-commerce operator in the mainland of China. They are working on developing drones that can take a 200-kilo payload. And they can take that 200 kilometers. Now I can see how that could be economically viable. Because that 200-kilo payload, which, by the way, is about 2 of me, that could be 40 or 50 individual online shopping deliveries, which could be taken 180, 190 kilometers to a rather remote location, instead of having to go on a truck or a train, and then have local distribution in that local area. So now I can see how the commercial viability could apply. But we're in the same situation with all of these autonomous vehicle technologies, is that the regulatory framework, the safety, the security, the insurance, the responsibility, the liabilities are not yet set out to be able to accommodate the technology which is readily deployable. Interesting developments in drones is our friend Helios. Helios is the world's first collision-tolerant drone. The drone is inside this metal sphere cage, so it's protected. It can be used if you imagine inspecting the inside of a steel plant or the inside of a waterworks. This drone with a full 180 swivel camera in it can go down inside areas that it's difficult or dangerous to access. And effectively, it can bounce off the walls because it's collision proof, because it's protected by this metal cage. So not necessarily applications within the supply chain, but if we stretch our thinking as to how these drones could be deployed in other areas, then we can see how useful this could be. So digital disruption in the supply chain, we looked at the warehouse, looked at production, and we looked at the transportation. So let's just reflect on that and come together with some takeaways for you. First of all, some pitfalls. This digital disruption is all very well, but there are risks associated with the deployment of new technology. And I'll share 3 of them with you, all of which are very recent. They've happened in the last 60 days. First of all, we've seen, and this isn't directly relevant to supply chain, but it does show the power of big data. We've seen this scandal that has taken $100 billion of market value off one of the world's largest companies. The scandal about mining the data from Facebook by this company called Cambridge Analytica to influence the outcome of political elections. Nothing to do with the supply chain, but 50 million people's data apparently got abused in the world of big data, helped by cloud, helped by Internet of Things, resulting in predictive analytics and influencing people's decision making. So that's one pitfall of digital disruption. The second one is, tragically, in March, was the first fatality of a pedestrian by an autonomous vehicle. This was an Uber vehicle, I think it was in California, and the vehicle was on autonomous mode, and the pedestrian stepped out into the road rather suddenly, and the autonomous vehicle did not respond quickly enough, and the operator of the vehicle was not able to respond quickly enough. The first pedestrian fatality. That has to put back, in terms of deployment, autonomous vehicles in public environments, because that's the first one. So now they're reviewing the trials, they're reviewing the technology. Also last week, by the way, Tesla had a fatality. That was the actual driver that was driving, was in the autonomous vehicle. And then thirdly, the infamous Bitcoin. Does anybody own Bitcoins? Anybody here own some Bitcoins? Yeah, just the wealthy people. Good for you. Okay. So there's a couple of things with Bitcoin. One is fact and one is my opinion. The fact is that the week before last, so Bitcoin leverages blockchain technology. Blockchain technology is a lump of blocks. The data cannot be changed. Okay? It's been discovered that in the blocks within the Bitcoin application, there is child pornography embedded in some of the blocks of the blockchain that supports Bitcoin. And in many environments, that would make it actually illegal to be using Bitcoin. So just those wealthy people that are owning Bitcoins, just beware. My view is that the dramatic volatility and speculation of Bitcoin actually impacts negatively the credibility of the blockchain technology. Because with what we know about Bitcoin, would you want to be using blockchain in your wallet to pay for your groceries? Probably not if you associate blockchain with Bitcoin. So again, I think we've got hiccups on the journey to some of these deployments of these technologies. So enough of my opinions. Let's hear from some very wise people. First of all, Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft. And a few years ago, he said that when we, the world, or him, Microsoft, when we are looking at the impact of technology, when we look at an 18-month horizon, we generally speaking overestimate the impact that technology will have over 18 months. And what he also said was that when we look at a 10-year horizon, the impact of technology over a 10-year horizon is we massively, massively underestimate the impact it will have. And those words have stuck with me as we've progressed through recent decades and as we go into this next decade that I see taking us through to 2030. So let's give a couple of examples. Just over 10 years ago, in fact, just over 11 years ago, so in the Bill Gates horizon, this is a 10-year horizon. Anybody know what they were doing in January 2007? Can anybody remember? January 2007 was when the smartphone was launched. Steve Jobs, California, January 2007. This thing was born. That's only 11 years ago. So if you take your mind back 11 years ago, could you have predicted what was going to happen through the deployment of that technology? Because 10 years on from the smartphone being launched by Steve Jobs in 2017, within 1 minute, within 60 seconds, these are the things that happened in the digital world in 60 seconds in 2017. Now, I don't think even Steve Jobs or Bill Gates could have imagined that 10 years from the launch of the smartphone, that would be the world that we are in. So when we're thinking about 10 years from now, if we're thinking about 2030, I would defy anybody to be able to predict where this is going, what's happening. So I think the important thing is not being able to predict, it's being able to be prepared for what might eventuate. So if we think back to Bill Gates' 18 months, he said we massively overestimate what's going to be the impact within 18 months. So let's look at another almost 18 months. It's actually 20 months away from today. In fact, it's 637 days from today will be the 1st of January 2020. So what's going to happen then? Well, these are some of the predictions that are going to be happening by 2020, which is 637 days from now. But if we take the knowledge and the wisdom of Bill Gates, then we're probably overestimating many of these things. And when it comes to supply chain disruption over the next 18 months, in my view, there are 4 big things that are going to impact supply chains in the next 18 months. And none of them are to do with technology. I think the biggest impact we're going to see in supply chains the next 18 months through to 2020 is going to come from 4 factors. Trade flows, goods flows, and freight flows over the next 18 months. The supply chain disruption is going to depend on what these 4 guys do. And as we know, it's difficult to predict what any of them is going to do. So it's not about predicting, it's about being prepared for what might happen. So let's round out thinking about 2030. If we think about 2030 and the digital disruption across the supply chain, who could possibly predict what's going to happen? But the saying about digital disruption is that if you're not seeing digital disruption in your business, in your sector, then it's more likely that you're not looking hard enough rather than it does not exist. Some more words of wisdom. First of all, Charles Darwin talks about it's not the strongest, it's not the most intelligent, it's the most adaptable to change that survives. And Oscar Wilde says that to expect the unexpected shows a thoroughly modern impact. And that other world-renowned philosopher, Mike Tyson, he said that everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. So the digital future is here and now. So my question is, are you ready? Are you prepared for the digital disruption that will be coming in the supply chain?